Good morning again to everybody. I'm Kim Bausum-Brown. I'm the Dyslexia and Specialized Reading Specialist for the Virginia Department of Education. I work out of the Office of Instruction, Office of Special Education Instructional Services. And I'm happy to be here with you all and happy to share some information about reading. So this morning, I titled my presentation, "What is the Science of Reading and Why is it critical for students with disabilities? And what should SDI look like for my students in the classroom?" So we are going to spend some time in talking about kind of where we are with reading nationally, statewide, have some information to share with you regarding the science of reading, why it's critical. I think it's an important discussion that we have, and understand why it's critical for us, especially, and for our students, that core instruction adopt evidence-based practices that are aligned with the science of reading, and again, then review what should SDI look like for instruction. I'm also going to share with you some legislation that's important for you to know, in particular, some that's happening that will take place, or excuse me, what's the right word, that will take effect July 1, and give you a sense of some of the reading professional development that that's coming out of our office. So a lot to accomplish, and I hope you find it beneficial. So we're going to get started with some poll questions, just so I get an idea of my audience a little bit. So if you don't mind, the first one is, if you would describe yourself regarding the science of reading and your knowledge base. You have a strong knowledge base around it. You have some understanding. You kind of get it. You've heard a little bit of the conversation, or you don't have any idea what they're really talking about when we say the science of reading, and that's okay. Okay, great. So we're going to kind of end it there. And what I'm seeing is that many of you, the majority of you, have some understanding of the science of reading. So hopefully by the time we end today, you'll have a little clearer picture, or certainly some resources to go to clarify any further confusions or questions you may have regarding it. So great, thank you. So let's go on to question 2. So what I'd like to know is if you have participated in LETTERS, which is a current VDOE project that's going on from my office. I lead that project, and I'm just wondering how many of you have had the opportunity to participate in that coursework. Toward the end of the presentation today, I'll talk about that a little more and hopefully encourage a few of you, if the opportunity comes your way, to be sure and take advantage of it. So I'll talk more about that and the divisions that are participating in that, and some of what's coming as a result of that participation. So great. So about 10 of you have participated in that. So we had 55 to answer. Kristen, how many do we have participants right now? Is it showing? I'm just trying to get a sense of.
We have about 60.
Okay, great. So we had about 55 responses. All righty, wonderful, thank you. And then the last question I have is, how many of you have had the opportunity to participate in the VDOE's multisensory structured literacy training, or a similar training based on any Orton-Gillingham method? You may have participated in some training, Inspire in Wilson and Foundations. You might have attended an IMSC training. Let me know if you have participated in any of that. That's we'll talk more about that. I'll give you some more detail regarding that project coming out of our office as well. That's probably in our 7th year of offering that. Okay, so about 17 of you, fantastic, have been able to participate, 18 of you in that project. Wonderful. So you have some background knowledge in some structured literacy, so that's great. Okay, thank you for your participation. That gives me a great understanding of kind of where we are there. So we can end the polling. I'm gonna X out of that. Great. So, gosh, when you hear the term science of reading, I'm wondering how many of you are thinking, and quite rightly possibly, is that, gosh, we're back to that old conversation regarding reading wars. The reading wars that have been really kind of permeating the literacy world for, I don't know, 30, 40 years. We've been talking about it and the pendulum has swung. And here we are back again. And I want to give credit to the person who's really reignited the conversation, and that's Emily Hanford. She has a series of articles. She's a journalist for American Public Radio Reports, and she is has really delved into this topic, has done some really great reporting, and has 4 articles now, has a podcast dedicated to the science of reading, and really has reignited this topic in literacy. So, and here's the thing. So let's kind of, at the core of the literacy wars, you might think, and rightly so, that phonics was at the core of it. Do we teach phonics? Do we not teach phonics? How do we teach it? And really, the question of whether to include phonics instruction has been resolved. That's not a question anymore. The answer is yes. Government-funded documents have shown that phonics instruction is helpful for all students, harmful for none, and crucial for some. And I think that's one of the most important statements that we have right now. Phonics instruction is helpful for all students, harmful for none, and crucial for some. And it's our students that it's crucial for. This actually comes out of the literacy brief by the International Literacy Association, used to be IRA, it's now ILA, and it is linked here. By the way, this PowerPoint is in your folder, so the links are live, and this link should take you right to that brief. Several pages, lots of good information. I encourage you to take a look at it. Meeting the Challenges of Early Literacy Phonics Instruction, the International Reading Association. So there really isn't a question of phonics, but our approach to reading and the existence of 2 philosophies of what reading instruction, especially at K2, still does exist. So the science of reading, I want to first start out by giving you 2 resources, 2 websites that I think offer you additional information outside of what I'm going to share today. And they are relatively new organizations, especially the first one, the Science of Reading, a Defining Movement. This is a group of folks in the research of literacy world. They have gotten together and they really want to define the science of reading and really clarify what that means. And the website is up. I think it's been live for about 3 months. Notable names are associated with it. I think it's an offshoot of the Reading League, which I'm going to share in a minute, but really trying to take this concept of the science of reading and debunk myths around it and just really explain what we're talking about when we're talking about the science of reading. You know, when new things come in, all of a sudden we all have a definition for it. We all have, you know, our own take on it. So this is an organization really trying to do reflect the science of reading in a very pure, fair, excuse me, way. I have a sore throat today. The second organization I want to share is the Reading League, which is a national organization, probably less than, it's actually 5 years old. It's a national not-for-profit that promotes knowledge to reimagine the future of literacy education, accelerate the global movement toward reading instruction rooted in science. So that, again, is, you can reach both of those organizations here. They are live linked, and I encourage you to take a look. Reading League offers lots of great resources. They offer training, and they have free channels of webinars up on YouTube, and I encourage you to take a look at all of that. So let's get into it. What exactly is the science of reading? The science of reading, when we say that, what we're referring to is the vast, and I mean vast, interdisciplinary body of scientifically based research about reading and issues related to both reading and writing. In fact, reading is the most researched topic in education. The most dollars have been spent on reading in the last 40 years. So you would think we'd have a little more together, but this research has been conducted over the last 5 decades across the world, and is derived from thousands of studies conducted in multiple languages. It includes, the science of reading has culminated in a preponderance of evidence to inform how proficient reading and writing develop. We know, based on science, based on these studies, why some kids have difficulty. And we know how we can most effectively assess and teach, and therefore improve student outcomes through both prevention and intervention for reading difficulties. So we can stop the difficulties. And then when the difficulties do happen, we can also, I'm sorry, I'm not showing my face. The difficulties can also be remediated. I did scientifically based also means an experimental design, detailed description of study methods, and in a peer-reviewed journal. So when they say scientifically based, that's also what is meant by that. So the science of reading is derived from researchers from multiple fields. And I think this is, if you've read David Kilpatrick's book, he lists probably 40 journals and you know, a variety of fields in which this research, this vast amount of research is coming from. And it includes the field of cognitive psychology, communication sciences, which I spelled wrong, developmental psychology, education, of course, implementation science, linguistics, neuroscience, school psychology. Again, reading is the most studied aspect of human learning. And if you're not familiar with that name, Louisa Moats, she is actually the author of Letters that we'll talk about later, along with Carol Tolman. And she's incredibly vocal in the literacy world and a proponent, certainly, of the science behind it. There is 4 major research syntheses that you might want to take a look at that I've listed here. It's certainly not limited to these 4, but these are kind of major research. And they're all consistent in the findings of learning to teach reading and learning to read and to teach and teaching reading. And that includes, of course, the National Reading Panel report of 2000, National Inquiry into the Teaching of Literacy of 2005, the Independent Review of Teaching Early Reading in 2006, and the National Early Literacy Panel of 2008. Again, these are hyperlinked for your pleasure. As important as what the science of reading is, it's also important to understand what it's not. And I need you to hear this really clearly. It's not a push for code-based instruction. It's not a push for phonics. It's not a push for going back to ditto papers on phonics. It is not a push for code-based instruction, without simultaneous high quality and explicit language and meaning-based instruction. And in a few minutes, we'll look at the simple view of reading, which will really illuminate that for you a little bit if you're not familiar with that theoretical model. It's also not Effective reading instruction is not adding one new program after another to programs already in your school without determining one's effectiveness and efficacy based on research. So it's not this constant turnover. And contrary to claims made by some of the latest and best reading practices, it's not a balanced approach. It's not 50% whole language and 50% phonics. That's something that is really becoming kind of the, well, let's meet halfway. Let's do some whole language here and some code-based instruction here, and base our practices on the science a little bit here, but that's not going to work. And hopefully by the end of our time together, you'll understand why that is not going to work. And to my dismay, there's a couple folks that I trust out there. A book I'm reading right now by Wiley Blevins, who's promoting that, and that is an interesting and just not going to work for our readers. So again, science of reading is not an ideology, a philosophy. It's not a fad, trend, new idea, or a pendulum swing. This is not new. The science that has been collected over 40 years isn't new. It's not a political agenda. It's not a one-size-fits-all approach. It's not a program. It's not a single specific component of instruction such as phonics. It's all of the evidence that points to how kids learn to read and how to teach reading effectively. So, important findings from some of the research that we mentioned before. If core instruction provided students in reading is evidence-based, grounded in the science of reading, we have the ability to maximize student learning performance and minimize the impact of reading weaknesses or a disability a disability has on a student. So when we are providing core instruction from the get-go in kindergarten that reflects what we know about kids learning to read and how to teach reading, we are going to maximize learning and minimize the impact on a struggling reader, including those with dyslexia or a learning disability. Prevention for at-risk learners. The National Reading Panel tells us if you provide kindergartners with 1, direct and explicit phonological awareness training, 2, ample letter sound instruction, and 3, teach the connections between those two, you will substantially reduce the number of students struggling in reading at the end of first, second, and even later grades, because what we do K1, 2 impacts everything that happens after that, everything. So we have to get it right, and our colleagues have to get it right. Early intervention, according to Valutino et al. In 1996, found that 67% of first grade students who did poorly with letter name, letter sounds, and basic phonological awareness, who were provided with intensive 15-week intervention in phonemic awareness, phonics, and connected text, scored at or above grade level in word level reading tests. Understand what you just heard there. Think about the students in your school that don't meet those PALS benchmarks. 15 weeks of intervention. 15 weeks, that's not even a full school year. 15 weeks of intervention in those 3 foundational skill areas, phonemic awareness, phonics, and connected text, which is scored at or above. We caught them up. That doesn't mean they're not still at-risk students, but that means that we've done some really good work, and we put those the intervention in place that they responded to, and the prevention and early intervention in place. Why is it important continuing this conversation? Because 12.5 million children struggle with some aspect of reading. Nearly 20% of our kids. With regular instruction, kids do not outgrow reading difficulties. And I think what I meant there with instruction as it is in most of our state and across the country, children won't outgrow it and don't outgrow their difficulties. I mean, we remediate it, well, some do. You don't outgrow a disability. But you can certainly minimize the impact. A child who is a poor reader at the end of first grade has almost, this kills me, 90% chance of remaining a poor reader at the end of grade 4. and at least a 75% chance of being a poor reader as long as they're in school. So look at your first grade classrooms. 90% of those that remain a poor reader at the end of fourth grade, you send them on as weak first grade students, they remain weak at fourth grade, they have at least a 75% chance of being a poor reader as long as they're in school. Research shows that children who don't learn to read by the end of third grade are likely to remain poor readers for the rest of their lives, and they're likely to fall behind in other academic areas. And we know this, reading is the cornerstone of learning. If it affects your reading, it's gonna affect everywhere else. People who struggle with reading are more likely to drop out of high school, end up in the criminal system, and live in poverty. As a nation, we have come to accept this high percentage of kids not reading, with more than 60% of American fourth graders not proficient readers, according to the NAEP. It's been that way since testing began in the 1990s. So we're accepting it. We've made very little adjustment. Here's the one that really should hit home for us as co-teachers, gen ed teachers, that are teams of gen ed and special ed teachers. According to the National Institute of Child Health and Human Development, it takes 4 times as long to intervene in the fourth grade as it does to intervene in late or first grade. And we're going to talk about more of that after we do a breakout. But I want you to remember that statistic. And I want to tell a quick story. I worked with a reading specialist in Richmond City Schools last year, right before COVID. We were doing some great work at K1 and 2. And she said to me one day, my gosh, I have this first grade group and I have this fourth grade group, and they're really kind of the same, at the same place in instruction. She said, but my first graders, I swear they catch on better, and they're kind of moving a little quicker, and they're really responding to the instruction. And I looked at her and I said, what do we know about fourth grade students? What do we know about what happens after third grade, fourth grade, fifth grade? Their brains become have less plasticity, and that instruction now is going to take 4 times as long. It was right there for her, and it was quite an aha moment. This isn't just black and white in a book. This is real. Prevention studies in reading commonly show that 70 to 90% of at-risk children, the bottom 20th in K2, can learn to decode an average range if they're instructed with evidence-based techniques. Barriers to the science of reading, we'll talk about them real quick. Part of the problem is that false theories about reading still exist, and they persist. We still think, and a majority of folks still think, that reading is as natural as speaking. And therefore, we think that immersing children in print and literature will teach children to read. And for 40% of our kids, that kind of works, but for 60% it does not. Teaching young children to look at pictures, skip over words, or guess. My favorite would be get your mouth ready. At words based on context will develop the strategies necessary for reading comprehension. Guessing doesn't work. Pictures disappear by the end of first grade. Skipping over words don't work. We have a code in our language. It's predictable. It's complex, but it's predictable. And when we teach the code of English and the code of our language, then we're giving kids the skill to unglue the words off the page. There are hundreds of, but we still don't believe that. We're still believing that it's natural, and if we immerse them in it, they will learn. We also still believe that there are 100 ways to learn to read. And so therefore, there's no single set of instructional principles that work for all children, and that is false. You know, if you were a teacher with me in the 80s and 90s starting out, do you remember hearing the discussion about, well, he's a whole word reader. Oh, he's a phonics reader. Well, let's try this with him. He's a different kind of reader. Well, we've learned about brain research, and we'll talk about this in a minute. No, all kids learn word recognition using the same neural pathways. And we're going to talk about what that looks like. We have brain research to back up the fact that no. There's one way that kids develop a sight word vocabulary, and that means a vocabulary of words that kids recognize instantaneously with automaticity. That's what their sight word vocabulary is. Might be a new use of that term for you. Again, additionally, despite scientific evidence and flatline reading scores on the NAEP, many teachers and school systems continue to embrace whole language approaches. For all its virtues, the National Reading Panel oversimplified complex reading findings on how children learn to read. And quite frankly, how many of us read that report when it came out? You know, the wonderful journals, one of the reasons why there's a gap too in what research says and teachers know as practice in the classrooms is that they write technically difficult articles. I will plug for a minute that the Reading League does have a journal, and one of their goals is to take complex reading topics and write them in a simplified way. And I don't mean to water it down so much, but really to read it in a for teachers, for practitioners to be able to make sense out of it and understand what should this look like in the classroom. What does this research mean for me as a classroom teacher? So again, I encourage you to look at that organization. Many programs may claim to be based in the science of reading, and you have to be careful. That's why you need to develop your knowledge in the science of reading so that you can become teachers who can critique and evaluate what a program is offering you, what an approach is offering you, and your own practices to know that you're aligned with the science of reading. The more empowered we are as teachers, the more the outcome we are going to create, the outcome we want in our students, which is literate young adults. I think I've talked a lot about this. Well, studies have shown that K-3 gen ed teachers, special ed teachers, ESL teachers are generally unfamiliar with the scientific findings regarding reading instruction acquisition and reading difficulties. And certainly, even as a group today, we showed that. The majority of us here have some understanding, but probably not enough to really know about whether our practices in the classroom are scientifically aligned. In accessibility, teachers generally do not have access to journals where studies are published, and if they do, those studies have a lot of vocabulary. It's going to require us to gain quite a background knowledge in statistics and meta-analysis and all of those good research things. So there's also over 100 of those journals. Translation of research into practice can be complex, although it's not impossible. And also instruction through higher ed. Where did we learn? Where do we go to school? Well, we've been through programs that are teaching whole language and balanced literacy approaches for the most part. So there have been some great things to come through the research, theoretical models, and a few of them I'm going to share with you because it's important for a couple reasons. The first one is the simple view of reading, and that is from the simple view of reading is from Guff and Tumner from 1986, and then it was revised with Hoover and Guff in 1990. And the simple view of reading is what actually letters, which I'm going to share with you in a little while, is based on. And what it's showing us is that reading is made up of two main components, and that's word recognition, language comprehension. When we have both of those pieces, and we have both of those pieces that are working to maximum, then we can create a skilled reader. You'll notice that these two components, we multiply them, and then we get the product of a skilled reading. This is a multiplication problem because one without the other is not going to result in a skilled reading. So for example, you can, a student can be weak in word recognition, and unless you're addressing that word recognition, they're not going to become stronger. a lot of times we think we can compensate for what is weak here by making this piece stronger, and that just isn't so. Conversely, it's also the same. So if a student has strong word recognition but weak language comprehension, that does not equate to a skilled reader because 1 times 0. So we'd give them, let's give the numerical assignment of 1 here. 1 times 0, they do not have this, equals 0. So you have to have both components well developed in students to create a skilled reader. And you'll also notice that word recognition is made up of sub-skills. The main sub-skills include phonological awareness, decoding and spelling, and development of sight word vocabulary. And again, we just mentioned that sight word vocabulary. That is all the words. For example, a student at the end of 1st grade, their sight word vocabulary is all of those words that they can read with automaticity, on sight, no decoding. Language comprehension includes several subcomponent skills: background knowledge, vocabulary, language structures, verbal reasoning, literacy knowledge. The definition of a skilled reader: fluent execution and coordination of language comprehension and word recognition. That is who we want our students to be. Notice that, as most of us know and understand, that word recognition, these foundational skills, are developed in that K2, actually even pre-K through 2. Generally, and then language comprehension is developed beginning in K all the way through 2. But our instruction in language in word recognition skills typically end at the end of 2nd grade. And at 3rd grade, we're ready to start more word study, advanced phonics instruction, syllabication, morphology, and applying word roots and suffixes. So it's imperative that those skills that need to be mastered in K2, that we take advantage of that time and we accomplish that. Hollis Scarborough is another theoretical model that came out of this research. And in 2001, she introduced the reading rope. And what you'll notice is that the reading rope is really a metaphor, using the rope as a metaphor to really illustrate the simple view of reading. Here's word recognition and those subcomponents that we talked about, language comprehension and those subcomponents. And you'll notice that as younger readers, we address those individually, and they're kind of, we're learning them, we're teaching students those, and as they become more proficient, those skills become more interwoven, stronger, and then they become both components, word recognition and language, it becomes intertwined. Our readers become increasingly strategic, increasingly automatic, until they reach that point where everything is integrated, skills are integrated and everything is flowing, and we have a skilled reader. Brain research I mentioned before, super important. A great deal of research has been done on the reading brain. The processing systems and their connecting pathways form a vast brain circuits transformed as we learn to read. That's important. That brain can change. When we provide the appropriate instruction, we can transform the reading brain and create those neural pathways in students where it's weak or not functioning as well, and help translate print into speech with accuracy, fluency, and comprehension. When teachers, I just ended a training last week, and I heard a teacher really connect her understanding of the brain and the circuitry to some other theoretical models, and could really then diagnose why a student was having difficulty and where that was happening. And it was really, the outcome was her understanding the miscue of the student and the mistake that the student was making, and she could fix it because of her background knowledge. Four-part processor by Mark Seidenberg, developed this along with McClellan in 1998. And this, my friends, is how students, this is the four-part processing model of word recognition. This is how students learn to recognize a word. We start with the orthographic processor. What does that word look like? What do we recognize? What are the sounds assigned to those patterns that I'm seeing, those letters? What does it mean? What do I know about that word? And then what do I know about the context of how that word is being used? So this is representative of the simple view of reading. Here's those word recognition skills, equaling the orthographic processor and our phonological processor, equaling that phonics piece, going up into meaning. This is where where kids start employing those language structure skills. But you can see how these theoretical models work and build on one another. And again, I think I mentioned, if I didn't, the simple view of reading has 150 citations of research behind it. So why is it important to really spend time with those theoretical models and understand them? And one of the most important reasons is because it helps us to understand profiles of readers. When we have kids, I've done a little bit of a simplified version here, but overall there's 4 profiles of readers. That includes our students that in this box would be strong comprehenders, strong strong word recognition students. That's our efficient, sufficient, skilled reader. Both areas are strong. This is a average to above average reader in our classroom. Then we recognize that some students have weak comprehension, strong word recognition, and sometimes in our line of work, we recognize those students maybe as hyperlexic, that they really get that word recognition piece. Oops, it comes almost automatic, and we refer to that kind of phenomenon as hyperlexic. Oftentimes we'll see this characteristic in our students with autism. Then we have students that are weak in both areas, weak comprehension. Oh, this should say word attack, I'm sorry. And weak word recognition. This is our garden variety, for lack of a better term. This is what's been used, so I'm repeating it, kind of our garden variety. This is actually the profile of student that makes up the greatest number of our students that are weak in our classrooms. And then we have students with stronger comprehension, or relatively strong comprehension, and weak word recognition skills. And those are our kids that we might say have characteristics of dyslexia or are dyslexic, because dyslexia means difficulty with words. So those kids who really can kind of, especially when content is read to them, have a stronger or have that ability to really are average or above average in meeting the benchmarks regarding language comprehension. So that's a stronger area for them as compared to the word recognition. Students in this, our garden variety of weak students, as I said, are our largest population in the classroom. This is the next area in terms of the larger number of students, and then students that have weak comprehension, strong sight word recognition are usually our lowest number of kids, or we see the lowest number of kids in that group. But when we can kind of start using the simple view of readings, Hollis Scarborough's reading rope, and contextualizing reading in those 2 components, and looking at the sub skills and being able to look at organized profiles of readers around those, then we can make some really good instructional and assessment choices for them. Okay, so looking at the science of reading the classroom, what would it look like just in philosophy, real quickly? Those that believe in the science know that reading is not natural, that reading is rocket science. And so therefore we use explicit and direct instruction in letter sound relationships and in phonological awareness. You'll often use decodable text to really build up those early foundational reading skills. We're building confidence, we're giving practice, lots of practice, which most students need in order for those letter sound relationships to really take hold. We use assessments such as phonological awareness assessments, maybe the PAST by David Kilpatrick or others that are out there. And we use phonics inventories, many of which are cheap, and I'll share with you. And we use programs or approaches that are evidence-based and grounded in the science of reading. And we know this, and we're critical, and we evaluate what we do because we have a strong background knowledge in it. Compare that to whole language classroom, or where meaning-based instruction is the priority, and the philosophy is that reading is natural. If we immerse the children in literature, they will read. Practices are mostly implicit instruction in phonics, kind of given as needed. And we see in a lot of balanced literacy classrooms a use of leveled readers, of which there's no science behind the efficacy of a leveled reader. Assessments used are typically running records with a missed cue analysis based on the 3 cueing system. The 3 cueing system, which lastly asks kids to use your graphophonic relationship, sound out that word. It's usually, the first one is asking kids what makes sense. And the 3 cueing system looks at or has kids that first strategy would be a guessing strategy. What do you think makes sense here? Programs that are whole language based, balanced literacy, guided reading, 4 blocks model. What might the shift look in your classroom? Well, if you're shifting from whole language to evidence-based practice, then you're going from the 3 cueing system to the 4-part processor. We're going to the science of how we know the brain works and how kids process words in order to recognize them with automaticity. We're going to leave implicit phonics, and we're going to instruct using explicit phonics. We're going to leave leveled text, and we're going to start using decodable text earlier in foundational reading for kids in that first grade classroom especially, and use these in a different way, and certainly not in K and first classrooms quite as early or in the same way. We're going to go from running records to using more phonics inventories and phonological awareness, progress monitoring, and really looking at those foundational skills with more of a microscope. Real quickly, I'm not going to go through this. I'm going to let you take a look at this yourself, but Louisa Motz, who I mentioned earlier, has an article, Whole Language Hijinks, How to Tell when Scientifically Based Instruction Isn't. She goes through each of the components of instruction, such as phonological awareness and phoneme awareness, and she compares the two. What might this is just another look at scientifically based reading research and whole language derivatives. What a compare contrast kind of T model here. So you'll see that it's included for phonics and word study. So I encourage you to come back to this and look at this information, vocabulary, the differences again, how that's taught in a meaning-based versus a code-based or a scientifically based research classroom to a whole language classroom, comprehension skills and strategies. What does that look like? And then writing. So what I've talked a lot, I've talked fast, I've talked too much. And so what I'm going to have you do is we're going to break you up into breakout rooms, about 4 each. And I just want you to have a discussion. I want you to introduce yourselves. Hopefully you're with new people, or at least 1 or 2 new folks. Introduce yourself. And I want you to just share with your group what literacy instruction looks like in your school and your division right now. Does your school or division embrace the science of reading? Has there been discussion about that? Are you in a school division that's really moving toward that? And what does that look like? Is that comfortable, uncomfortable? There's about 18 of you that have taken letters. Are there instructional shifts being made at K2 to address more PA and phonics in a more explicit and systematic way? And I know that at many schools, at least there's some work in PA. So we're going to break you out, give you about 6 minutes to talk amongst yourselves. And Alice, I was able to get to just 2 rooms, and I heard some good conversations, folks talking about some of their experiences with some training in phonics and some things that they use in terms of materials, and I'll share some things with you as well. as we go through this. We're going to kind of now turn our attention to our students with disabilities, and talk about them a little bit in terms of evidence-based practices and specially designed instruction. So I'm coming back to the simple view of reading, simply because I want to make the point that first of all, our students with specific learning disabilities, they're the largest category of students with disabilities in our state. I think right now they make up 32% of our students that are identified with disabilities. So, and many of you would probably say that our SLD kids are our largest number of our students with disabilities. And that makes sense. The other thing to remember about our students that are identified with a specific learning disability, which you already know, is that a majority of them come to be referred for with suspicion of a disability because of their reading weaknesses. A majority of SLD kids are referred because of reading weaknesses, and I would say up to 80%. And then a majority of those students that are found to be SLD, found to have a reading weakness here at the word recognition level. So a large percentage of your kids have a deficit in phonological awareness, decoding and spelling, which really impacts their development of sight word vocabulary. Remember, that means to be able to identify a great number of words with automaticity. So it's important to remember, because we need to look for those, especially in older kids, for different reasons. Now, we do, one of the realities too of our kids, especially as they get older, is if they have weak word recognition, they're less likely to engage in reading, because reading is hard. It's laborious, and there's not great feeling that comes from that. So they do less of it. And if they do less of it and they engage in reading activities less, it makes sense that this area would begin to weaken or be compromised, especially in vocabulary and background knowledge, because if you read less, you have less exposure to background knowledge, building that, as well as vocabulary, as well as the other components. So this is actually called the Matthew effect. And that's why that's one of the, an additional reason of why we want to impact kids and impact them early, impact them when their brains have the most plasticity and will take in this information, and their pathways will develop correctly, and we can minimize this so that they can engage in reading activities and literacy, and that there's less impact on this piece too, so that we do come and our outcome is more students that are skilled readers. So this theoretical model is very applicable and appropriate to really talk about students with specific learning disabilities. And I think it just helps to sometimes really conceptualize what's going on with your kids in a different way. So I just want to talk a little bit and kind of share with you a common instruction, probably because I want to illuminate one more time kind of what you guys, certainly what I saw in my 25 years of being in a school division as a special education teacher, and working with you all, teachers across the state now. And for just a minute, I want you to pretend that we have a fourth grader named Carly. And I want to look at Carly historically. She's at Happy Hill Road Elementary School. And when she was a kindergartner, She had reading instruction that was whole language based. And she had very little teaching and foundational reading skills through an explicit model. It was mostly all whole language practices to teach those. She did start showing some at risk. She was not meeting a benchmark in PALS, so she did get some intervention. And she had a little bit of letter PA and letter naming in kindergarten. Now, core is a whole bunch of time, and in kindergarten, do not hold me to this, but probably 50% of your time should be dedicated to those word recognition, or even 60% those word recognition, those foundational reading skills. If she's receiving this in kindergarten for a majority of her literacy time, then the instruction that she really needs, because she's not meeting benchmarks in those foundational skills, she's really only getting 20 to 30 minutes a day. So even if an intervention, we're using more explicit instruction in phonemic awareness or phonics, it's for a minimal time a day. And also, this instruction is at odds with whole language practices. Oftentimes, however, the tiered intervention provided is really more of the same, isn't it? That you get in whole group, in core. She moved on to first grade. In first grade, we're using whole language practices to teach foundational skills. Intervention might possibly have some explicit instruction in PA and phonics and those foundational skills. Again, I'm only getting 20 to 30 minutes of that. And it's contrary to what's being taught in my core classes. So I'm still behind, I'm still struggling, and I'm really not getting what I need. And then comes second grade. And my teacher is really noticing this issue, but I'm still getting core language literacy instruction based on whole language. Now this time, this spring, this winter, my teacher referred me for special education. And in the spring of second grade, I was found to have a specific learning disability with a weakness at those in phonological awareness. So at the end of second grade and third grade, I'm still in the classroom where whole language is being taught and those approaches are being used. But now I get 30, 45 minutes of specially designed instruction. And my teacher had some great training. So she is really using a structured literacy approach to address those foundational reading skills, doing some phonemic awareness with me. So I'm slowly making some gains. Raise your hand if you can relate to this scenario that I laid out rather roughly, but the scenario that I laid out for kids. Raise your hand if you can relate to that, if that's something common happening in your building, that's that scenario. And I, for some reason, I don't have a great view here, but I see many hands raised. Yeah. So oftentimes, and what's the problem? Well, here's my brain plasticity. In kindergarten, I'm ripe for learning. I'm ripe for learning in first grade. Second grade, I'm ripe for learning. But third grade, finally getting what I need. Little bit of, the best that my teachers can provide. But now my brain is less efficient at taking that learning in. And if we give 20 to 30 minutes down here, first of all, we know we could have minimized the issues here, maybe even minimized them to the point where we didn't have to refer her for special ed. And if this is 20 minutes of of intervention down here and it's going to take 4 times as long, well, that's really 80 minutes. Is anybody providing 80 minutes of instruction to their 3rd, 4th, and 5th graders in foundational reading skills?
No.
All right. So I've illustrated something that we're all very familiar with. And again, my point is we have got to advocate, and we have got to advocate for core instruction aligned with the science of reading. All right. It's critical for our students, you guys, and we just illustrated it. 4 times as long to intervene than it would be in late kindergarten to 1st grade. Prevention studies and reading commonly show, we talked about this, I don't need to mention it again. So how do we improve outcomes for students with disabilities in literacy? Where could we start? What can we do? And first, I would say to you, advocate for the science of reading in your school and at your division level. And I'll talk more about, I've got even some question stems that you might pose later on this summer or in the fall to your school. We'll talk about that toward the end. I'll show you those. Participate in opportunities to learn more about evidence-based practices grounded in the science of reading. So when those trainings come up, sign up for them, participate in them. Develop standard-based IEPs for your students. Raise your hand right now if you in your school use standard-based, IEPs, if you develop and write standard-based IEPs. Raise your hand. Okay, so about 12, 13, 12, somebody can't decide, that's okay. Might not know how to, the hand thing. Now 11 of you developed standard-based IEPs. Well, I'm gonna make a plug here right now because using a standard-based IEP approach is going to increase the likelihood that you are providing targeted, appropriate, specially designed instruction. This isn't a training on that right now, but there are modules on the VDOE to show you that process. There's an incredible amount of resources on that page that show you that. I will make a note and I will hyperlink after this in the Google folder. I will hyperlink the that page of the VDOE to that so you can see for the standard-based IEPs. Provide specially designed instruction that includes instruction based on individual needs, appropriate accommodations, and appropriate assistive technology. And in your IEP meetings, considerations page, I think it's number 8 that asks you, does this student need assistive technology? And if you are answering no all the time, just as, as a knee-jerk reaction, you really need to stop. And you need to consider that if this student is not an efficient reader, how are we, reader or writer, how are we accommodating that student? How are we leveling the playing field in the classroom so that student can meet the requirements of the general education curriculum? Assess foundational reading skills. Oftentimes your IEPs might have fluency or just comprehension goals. Remember that a majority of students with a specific learning disability have reading issues, reading weaknesses at that foundational level. So for a majority of kids, you should be seeing IEP goals that reflect weakness, that reflect a need for instruction in PA and phonics. If you're not seeing that, then I would encourage you, and you're seeing things like a fluency goal, I would encourage you to do some assessments such as like a phonological awareness assessment, such as the PAST, and a phonics inventory. There are free ones out there. And I have linked them. I'll show you where those are, such as letters, core, and cool tools. So there are assessments that will encourage you to give your students so that you can really look at where they are with foundational reading skills, get a better sense of that. A lot of times we think getting back to the fluency goal, a lot of times students can't meet that word per minute benchmark because they have issues at word recognition, with word recognition. And we're calling it fluency, but it's really not fluency. A lot of kids that have comprehension issues and weaknesses, they're a result of kids not being able to unglue the words on the page. So I would encourage you to look at that, address those foundational reading skills with your students. So again, advocate for evidence-based practices grounded in the science of reading in your building, participate in opportunities that come along, develop standard-based IEPs. We're going to talk about them more in the next slide. Provide specially designed instruction that includes the following, and assess foundational reading skills. Real quickly, those standard-based goals, here's why it will increase the likelihood of you providing really quality, specially designed instruction. Because when you write a goal that is standard-based, you're giving that next teacher a better blueprint for the instruction. Here's a goal that probably many of us are familiar with. I've written it myself, a traditional IEP goal. By June 2021, John will read on grade level and demonstrate improved comprehension strategies as measured by classroom and state assessments. Number one, there's no criteria on that goal. It's missing a component, but really, what does it mean to demonstrate improved comprehension strategies? That's huge. And it's very vague, non-specific. In contrast, a standard-based IEP goal, which is based on grade level standards, when reading grade appropriate materials, the student will apply knowledge of word structure and context clues to determine the meaning of unfamiliar words with 80% accuracy by the end of the school term. Now you've got a goal where you're working on two specific things. You want to see this student apply knowledge of word structure and context clues to determine the meaning of unfamiliar words. That's specific. That's what you're going to provide instruction in. That's what you're going to take data on. So that's just a quick look at the difference between a traditional and a standard-based goal. Again, standard-based goals are going to increase your likelihood that you're going to provide targeted, specific, specially designed instruction. Here are a couple goals with examples. Again, standard-based goals. This is a 5th grade one. It talks about what the SDI might look like. This student needs to locate information, make inferences, support conclusions. You might use a sim learning strategy. Such as fundamentals of paraphrasing and summarizing. You might use another sim strategy, self-questioning, predictions. Accommodations might include the following, such as a student to use a graphic organizer. That's an example of what that goal might look like, the SDI following it, and an accommodation. Here's a functional. This is a 5th grade student who still needs to work on those foundational reading skills. So by the end of the school year, using taught strategies to decode unfamiliar words, the student will apply knowledge to decode single and multisyllabic words in authentic text. Here are the patterns they're going to work on, 4 out of 5 consecutive sessions with 90% accuracy. That is a goal for a kid who still needs those foundational reading skills, even in the 5th grade. That's what your SDI is going to focus on for him. You're going to perhaps use a structured literacy approach, Orton Gillingham, SPIRE, IMSE. I heard somebody mention that. Good trainings, or just plain old explicit systematic phonics. And I'm going to show you where to find some of those resources. SDI instruction to address those foundational reading skills, which we've been talking about most of the morning. The delivery needs to be explicit, systematic, cumulative. That's what differs us. Are explicit, that's what makes it SDI. When we're teaching those foundational reading skills, not using those but using using an explicit, systematic, cumulative approach. The content should be evidence-based instruction and language structure, often called structured literacy. Should include phonemic awareness, phonics, syllabication, morphology, syntax, and semantics. Those are language structures, and all of those should be included when your students have a deficit in those foundational reading skills. Now, real quick, this is the one I could not fit anywhere or decide where to put it, and I just want to clarify these terms for you. Science of reading. Remember at the top of this, we talked about that it's scientifically based research, thousands of studies, 50 decades, informs how proficient reading writing develops. These are the studies. Evidence-based practices are the scientific research that involves the comparison of literacy programs or practices, generate what we refer to as evidence for whether or not the program or approach works. When multiple studies contribute consistently positive results, the instruction that was studied may be considered an evidence-based practice. So, a whole lot of science here. An evidence-based practice is the one who's been through the rigorous scientific kind of look-see. It's got to be peer reviewed. It's got to have a certain, it's got to have hit certain marks in order to become an evidence-based practice. One that we know right off the bat is teaching phonics systematically and explicitly. Structured literacy is a piece of that. It's focused more on code-based instruction rather than meaning-based. So evidence-based practices, I just want to go back to that real quick, includes both components of the simple view of reading. Structured literacy is really about the word recognition component of the simple view of reading, okay? So we're going from real big picture to now more streamlined practices across the simple view of reading. Structured literacy is really about the word recognition part of the simple view of reading. Resources for your instruction. If you've got kids in need of, and I know you do in your classroom, that need explicit systematic PA, phonological awareness, because if you're not doing that, all the phonics in the world you do is not going to make up for what you don't do in PA. University of Florida has a virtual literacy hub. There's a scope and sequence there of how you should teach, when you should teach, what you should teach. Grapheme phoneme correspondences, some activities on phonemic awareness. So the virtual teaching literacy hub is there. Even though it's virtual, their stuff is also accessible without having to use it virtually. High leverage practices. Somebody asked in the questions, are there videos on explicit training videos? Here's a video for high leverage practices using explicit instruction. And I just found this recently. This is the M.A. Rooning Foundation. Please, if you don't go anywhere else, click on this. There's a manual for teaching structured literacy. There's a quick start guide. There are lesson plans, and there's a card deck that you can print out to use with students. The assessments, David Kilpatrick's PAST is here. This is a great tool. This is going to give you information on your students of where they are in phonological awareness and phonemic awareness. It's going to give you a guidance, kind of how to do it, what to do it, and then the nice thing about the PAST is that you are looking at two behaviors from your students, and that is accuracy and automaticity. Important components there. Core phonics inventory here, cool tools inventory. This is going to ask your kids to read a list of words, and you're going to get a sense of what they recognize in terms of patterns. We're gonna have to, I think I'm losing time here, yeah. What's Virginia and the science of reading? What's going on? I don't know if you heard last year, Dr. Lane hosted right before COVID hit, Virginia Literacy Summit. February 25th, 2021. He introduced the 7 strategies for literacy improvement. Number 1 was enhance awareness of the science of reading for all learners, improve teacher preparation. Then in early October of this year, this should be 20, I'm sorry. There was a virtual summit for educators and superintendents to dive into the science behind literacy. So again, there was information shared with superintendents and folks from divisions to learn about the science of literacy, reflect on changes required of division leaders to implement high quality early literacy programs. And there's legislation that I'm going to share with you. Currently, we have some higher education, about 45, representing 18 private and public universities, professors participating in our letters project with the VDOE. So here's his 7 strategies to improve reading instruction. And you can see number 1 right here, science of reading. Number 2, teacher preparation. Here's the legislation you should know about it as folks that work with special education students. Number 1, if you're going for your reading specialist degree, or you have folks in your building who have recently gone there, that preparation programs offered by public institution of higher ed or private need to provide coursework and other training in the identification of the appropriate interventions, accommodations, and teaching techniques for students with dyslexia. They require reading specialists to demonstrate mastery of an evidence-based structured literacy instructional approach. If you're going for your reading degree, I would ask your university how they address this legislation. Dyslexia advisor legislation. Raise your hand if you know in your division who your dyslexia advisor is. Nobody?
I didn't know we had that, so I'm sorry.
That's okay, it's not your
I'm
fault.
sorry.
That's why I'm letting you know.
Yeah, it looks like a lot of people are raising their hands.
Okay, I just have 6 that are coming through, 7, 8. I had 0 at first. Okay. Well, about 3, 4 years ago, this legislation took effect, and it's 1 reading specialist employed by each local school board that employs a reading specialist shall have training and identification. Basically, each division should identify 1 person to act as or fulfill the role of dyslexia advisor in their division. There is no specific role that the VDOE or the legislation has deemed for this person, so it's really something that that the division defines themselves. Part of my job is providing technical assistance to this person in your division. I can say, with the exception of maybe 2 divisions, each division has a person identified for this role. So if you'd like to know who yours is, you are welcome to email me. This might be somebody that you ask information of, or ask to share information. May have some questions about dyslexia, may request some training in dyslexia, some overview, broad strokes kinds of things, but that person does exist in your division, and you might want to know the name and know the role that that person has in your division. Legislation continued. This is important. This takes place as of July 1. Reading intervention services. This affects the kids before you get them, the kids that you're going to have 2 or 3 years from now, or possibly serving in your currently. Certain students in K through 3rd grade, reading intervention services requires reading services for students in K through 3 who demonstrate deficiencies on their standards of learning reading test or any other diagnostic test that meets criteria such as PALS. Must have the intervention they receive must be evidence-based, including services that are grounded in the science of reading and include explicit, systematic, sequential, and cumulative instruction to include phonemic awareness, so on and so forth. This is important. My question, if I were going back into a school system for my reading specialist, for my leadership in my building, is what is intervention in literacy going to look like for our students based on this legislation? How does our current practice align with evidence-based practices grounded in the science of reading? Projects that are supporting literacy coming out of my office. Language Essentials for Teachers of Reading and Special Spelling, also known as LETTERS. It's coursework. It's offered, there are 70, and I'm going to show you the list, 70 divisions that are participating this year. It's about 4th year we're about to enter. This coursework provides in-depth knowledge based on the most current research. It is a 32-week program. Volume 1 itself is worth 2 college classes, graduate classes. If you get the opportunity to participate, I would encourage you to do so. The same with an OG training or the multisensory structured literacy training. This is different. Letters is coursework. It's really about building that knowledge base, whereas IMSC or OG training is really specific to that structured literacy lesson plan and instructional model. 2 different trainings, 2 different purposes, both valuable to both gen ed and special ed. And both are open to both special ed, general ed teachers, and reading specialists. Here are the divisions that are engaged with our this coming year, that are engaged with letters. Division.
Hey, Kim.
Yeah.
I'm sorry to interrupt. There's several people who want to know how they can sign up to be trained in that. Do you have?
So here's the last of that. Yeah, I'm glad you asked. So if your division is on this list, then your dyslexia advisor is the person that we work through with this particular project. So I would contact them and I would ask if there are, how it's being rolled out. I can tell you this, the VDOE provides training for the dyslexia advisor who's a facilitator in letters. We also provide 10 free licenses every year to teachers in the division. The dyslexia advisor and leadership generally chooses their plan. And in many cases, they're asking for volunteers. So I would make contact with your dyslexia advisor, and I'm happy to provide that information. It's not a quick one and done. There's a lot to the training, but I've only really gotten a lot of positive feedback on it. Here's a curriculum evaluation tool from the Reading League. If you want to start thinking about how does what we do in our classroom align with the science of reading, they have created a curriculum and evaluation tool. I'm just going to give you one page as an example. Here they've taken phonological and phonemic awareness, and there are green flags and red flags. If your instruction reflects what's under the components under the green flag, then most likely you're aligned with the science of reading. If you really fit, your practices really fit more of what's being described under the red flags, then you probably need to make adjustments to your instruction. This includes, the Reading League has included all components, all of these components. So you can look at your practice in building background knowledge or your vocabulary. How do you, what are your practices in your classroom regarding vocabulary, and how does it align to the simple view of reading? So that is provided there. Here are those conversation starters. Oh, that was a loud sound. Here are those conversation starters that we talked about that you might want to take a look at and talk with your division about. might ask your dyslexia advisors, and here are some of the resources that we talked about. Here's that curriculum and evaluation tool. Now I'm going to get to your questions because I know there was one in particular. Let me get to the chat. Ooh, 71. Okay.
Yeah, I think there was one